Everyone tells you the same story about money. Track every penny, cut every luxury, pay off all your debt before you invest a single dollar. Wait until you're ready, and whatever you do, don't spend on yourself until you've earned it. This is the language of financial responsibility. It's the advice passed down through generations, repeated by well-meaning family members, plastered across personal finance blogs, and quietly absorbed as moral fact. If you're doing these things, you're doing money right. But here's what the research actually shows. Many of the habits our culture labels as financially responsible are, neurologically speaking, working against the outcomes they're supposed to create. Not because the intentions behind them are wrong, because the brain does not respond to financial rules the way the rules assume it will. Research from the University of Chicago Booth School and behavioral economists studying financial self-regulation has found that the psychological cost of rigid financial self-control, the guilt, the deprivation mindset, the exhaustion of constant override, can quietly produce worse long-term financial outcomes than more moderate, sustainable approaches. Not worse outcomes because you're spending too much. Worse outcomes because the system itself becomes the problem. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through isn't a permission slip to stop caring about your money. It's an explanation for why some of the things you've been doing in the name of responsibility might be the exact reason you're not further along. And more importantly, it's going to show you why that is not a reflection of your character, your discipline, or your worth. Before we get into the specific habits, there's a piece of neuroscience that explains all of them. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for self-regulation, long-term planning, and overriding impulse, has a finite capacity. Financial habits that demand constant conscious effort draw from the same cognitive reservoir you use for every other decision across a day. Researchers have observed that when this capacity is depleted, the brain doesn't make careful, rational financial decisions. It defaults to whatever's easiest, most familiar, or most immediately relieving. The habits that require the most willpower to maintain are, by definition, the most expensive ones to sustain, and that changes how we need to think about what responsible actually means. The first habit is one almost everyone in the personal finance world agrees on, and the irony of it is worth understanding. Tracking every single expense. Here's something fascinating about the habit everyone tells you is the foundation of financial health. Research from the University of Cambridge on financial behavior found that daily expense tracking, when practiced with a self-critical or restriction-focused mindset, is associated with elevated financial anxiety and incented in some cases, increased impulsive spending in the days following a tracking failure. Not because tracking doesn't work. It would be because of what happens when the tracking goes wrong. There's a pattern in behavioral self-regulation research, sometimes called the abstinence violation effect. When someone who monitors obsessively misses a day, or opens their tracking app and sees a number they've decided is bad, the brain doesn't gently recalibrate. It catastrophizes. The monitoring system that was supposed to create control becomes a trigger for the exact behavior it was designed to prevent. Your prefrontal cortex registers failure. Your limbic system takes over. The internal narrative shifts from "I'm doing well" to "I already ruined it," and then behavior follows that story. This is the cycle. 3 weeks of meticulous tracking, 1 difficult week, then abandonment, starting over again next month, starting over again after that. Every restart feels like evidence that something is wrong with you. It isn't. It's a predictable neurological pattern that has nothing to do with your values or your intelligence. Your brain doesn't recalibrate gently after a perceived failure. It catastrophizes. And no tracking app was designed to account for that. Here's the important distinction. Tracking as judgment and tracking as information produce completely different outcomes in the nervous system. One activates the threat response, which narrows thinking and increases impulsive behavior. The other activates curiosity, which opens the prefrontal cortex back up. The habit isn't the problem. The framing of the habit is the problem. Watching your spending to understand yourself is fundamentally different, neurologically and behaviorally, from watching your spending to grade yourself. The first one builds financial awareness that accumulates over time. The second one builds a relationship with your own finances that you will eventually need to escape just to breathe. The second habit is the one that gets the most cultural reinforcement and also does some of the quietest damage. cutting out every small pleasure in the name of saving. Here's where it gets interesting and a little inconvenient for every piece of advice that has ever told you to eliminate your daily indulgences. Research from Harvard Business School on consumer behavior found that eliminating small, frequent pleasures without any substitution produces what researchers call deprivation backlash, a compensatory spending response in which the brain seeks to restore its baseline sense of reward, often through a larger, less planned purchase at a later point. The mechanism behind this is something called dopamine reward homeostasis. Your brain maintains a baseline expectation of reward across a day. When that baseline is consistently unmet, when every answer is no, when every impulse is denied, when pleasure has been reclassified as the enemy, the dopamine system doesn't quietly accept the new terms. It escalates. The craving signal grows louder until something gives. And when it gives, it usually gives at the worst time in the worst way, with the most guilt attached to it afterward. Here's the thing. Restriction doesn't eliminate spending. It delays and amplifies it. The person who cuts every small pleasure, who is disciplined and careful for weeks, and then spends several $100s on something unplanned and unexplained, is not a person who lacks willpower. Their willpower is extraordinary. The problem is that willpower is finite, and they've been spending it at a rate the nervous system cannot sustain indefinitely. The psychology behind deprivation backlash is this. Your brain will have its reward. The only question is whether you choose it consciously, in advance, with intention and a budget, or whether your nervous system chooses it for you in a moment of depletion, with none of those guardrails. Intentional pleasure spending, chosen and planned for, produces more satisfaction and less financial fallout than impulsive compensatory spending. Research on hedonic adaptation supports this. Anticipated pleasures, ones you've looked forward to, consistently produce greater satisfaction than unplanned ones. You're not saving money by eliminating joy. You're spending the same amount later with more guilt and less enjoyment attached to it. The trade-off is real and worth naming. Small daily pleasures do add up, and there are genuine cases where reducing them frees up meaningful resources. The cost is that doing so without a conscious replacement strategy, without a budget line for intentional enjoyment, can make the saving system feel like punishment. And systems that feel like punishment eventually get abandoned. The third habit is one of the most financially costly pieces of conventional advice, and the reason it persists is that it feels unambiguously virtuous. Paying off all debt before investing a single dollar. But here's what nobody tells you about the debt-first strategy. The mathematical and behavioral cost of delayed investing is, for many people, larger than the cost of the debt they were paying off, and it compounds in a direction you cannot reverse. Financial economists studying the outcomes of debt-first versus parallel debt and invest strategies have found that for people carrying lower interest debt, the decision to delay investing entirely produces an opportunity cost that never fully recovers. A simplified illustration, someone who waits 10 years to begin investing because they were eliminating debt first may never close the gap created by those missing years of compound growth, even if they invest aggressively afterward. The math on starting time is unforgiving. Not because the debt payoff was wrong, because the years the math required were spent on a strategy the nervous system preferred. And that's exactly the point. Your brain will always feel more relief from eliminating a present burden than from building a future asset, even when building the asset is the better choice. This is the well-documented phenomenon called present bias, sometimes described as temporal discounting. The brain overweights present relief relative to future gain. Paying off a debt and watching a balance reach zero produces immediate visceral satisfaction. The psychological weight lifts. It feels like a finish line. Investing, by contrast, produces no immediate relief. The money leaves your account and the benefit is abstract and decades away. Your nervous system was not designed to find that equally compelling. You're not irrational for wanting to eliminate debt first. That response is completely understandable. And for high-interest debt to anything significantly above typical market return rates, it is also mathematically correct. The nuance that gets lost is that not all debt functions the same way. A low-interest student loan or a modest mortgage is a different calculation than high-interest revolving debt. The brain, running on present bias, treats them identically. Debt is threat. Eliminate threat. Feel relief. The math does not agree. The fourth habit is one of the most common experiences in personal finance, and it almost never gets named for what it actually is. waiting until you have enough or know enough or are stable enough to start. But here's what nobody tells you about the psychology of readiness. Research on savings initiation behavior, including foundational work from behavioral economists Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler on savings inertia and automatic enrollment, has found that the threshold for readiness tends to shift upward automatically as income rises, as life becomes more complex, and as the stakes feel higher. The person who will start investing when they make more ends up, when they make more, deciding they'll start when things settle down. When things settle down, they'll start when the debt is gone. The readiness threshold is not a finish line, it's a moving one. The brain mechanism at work here is status quo bias, the well-documented tendency to treat inaction as the safe default. The pain of a wrong decision, the fear of investing badly, or choosing the wrong account or misunderstanding the process feels greater to the nervous system than the pain of no decision at all. So the brain finds reasons to wait. Each reason feels legitimate. None of them are the real reason. The real reason is that the brain weights the possibility of a mistake more heavily than the certainty of a missed decade of growth. This is the habit that may carry the heaviest financial cost of all 8, not because it involves overspending or poor choices, but because it involves no action at all. No. The compound growth that doesn't happen because the starting point was delayed by years leaves a gap that is both mathematical and permanent, not a discipline problem, not a knowledge problem. A status quo bias problem, and the difference between naming it correctly and naming it wrong is the difference between solving it and continuing to mistake caution for responsibility. The fifth habit is the one that looks the most like diligence. Checking your investment accounts frequently to stay on top of things. And here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive because this one actively costs many people money. Research from behavioral economists Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler on what they termed myopic loss aversion found that investors who check their portfolios more frequently are significantly more likely to make reactionary trades that reduce long-term returns, not because they're less informed, but because frequent checking activates loss aversion at short time scales where losses are statistically normal. Loss aversion is the tendency, well documented by researchers Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, for the brain to experience the pain of financial loss at roughly twice the intensity of the pleasure of an equivalent gain. A portfolio checked daily will show a loss more than a third of the time, even in a healthy market environment. Each of those losses activates the amygdala's threat detection system. Each activation makes the case quietly and persistently for doing something, for moving to safety, for stopping the bleeding. The cumulative effect of frequent checking isn't vigilance. It's a low-grade financial anxiety that nudges, over time, toward the most expensive possible response. The psychology behind obsessive portfolio checking is this. Your brain is not wired to interpret short-term market movement as statistically normal variation. It is wired to interpret every loss as a threat requiring a response. That wiring was adaptive in environments where losses were genuinely dangerous. It is costly in a market where short-term losses are an expected feature of long-term growth, not a signal that something has gone wrong. Here's the thing about financial vigilance. It can look responsible and function as anxiety. The trade-off is worth naming. Staying informed about your investments genuinely matters. The cost is that beyond a certain frequency, information stops serving the decisions it's supposed to support and starts fueling a reactivity that undermines them. Monthly or quarterly reviews give you the same actionable information as daily ones, with a fraction of the emotional toll. And the decisions you make from a calmer vantage point will nearly always be better than the ones you make from a state of threat activation. The sixth habit is one that rarely gets classified as a financial behavior at all because it lives in language rather than action. Telling yourself you're just not a money person. Here's something the research makes clear. And it's more uncomfortable than it sounds. Work drawing on Stanford researcher Carol Dweck's widely studied findings on implicit theories of ability has found that people who believe financial skill is a fixed trait, something you either have or don't, show markedly lower engagement with financial learning, lower savings rates, and higher financial avoidance than those who approach financial behavior as learnable. Not because the first group is less intelligent, because the identity closes the door before the capability is ever tested. Your brain treats identity as a filter. When the identity says not me, it stops attending to information that would prove otherwise. It files away financial content as irrelevant. It interprets confusion as confirmation. It experiences the financial avoidance not as a failure of effort, but as simple self-consistency. Of course, I don't understand this. I've never been a money person. The identity is self-fulfilling, not through some mysterious force, but through a very ordinary neurological one. The brain stops applying capability it has already decided isn't relevant. You're not a person who is simply incapable of managing money. You're a person whose brain was given a story that made capability feel beside the point. And the distinction matters enormously. Not a capability problem, an identity encoding problem. The behaviors that build financial stability, automating a savings transfer, leaving investment contributions running, reviewing a spending pattern once a month, don't require you to love finance or to feel fluent in it. They require you to do them. The identity doesn't have to change for the behaviors to change. And the behaviors are where the outcome lives. The seventh habit is less visible than the others because it's defined by an absence rather than an action. Managing money in complete isolation, never discussing it, never inviting accountability, keeping it private as a matter of principle or pride. But here's what nobody talks about when it comes to financial isolation. Research from behavioral economists studying peer effects in retirement savings, including well-documented work by Esther Duflo and Emmanuel Size on social influence in 401k enrollment, found that social accountability is one of the most consistently effective drivers of sustained financial behavior change, more effective than financial education, more effective than access to better tools, more effective than stated intention. The neurological basis for this is straightforward. The brain's motivational systems are fundamentally social. Behavior that occurs in a social context where identity and reputation are in some way engaged activates more persistent motivational circuits than behavior that happens entirely in private. This isn't about shame or external judgment. It is about the neurological reality that the brain takes social commitments more seriously than private ones, because in the environment the brain was designed for, social commitments carried real consequences. The person who quietly decides to save more is working against the grain of how behavior change actually sticks. Not because their intention is weak, because private intentions are neurologically cheaper to abandon than social ones. The psychology of financial isolation is this. The brain changes behavior most reliably when identity and social stakes are engaged, even lightly, even with just one trusted person. Financial privacy is legitimate and sometimes genuinely protective. Not every financial conversation is safe, and discretion about specifics is often wise. The trade-off is that complete isolation removes one of the most neurologically effective supports for sustained behavior change. You don't need an audience. You need a witness. One trusted person who knows what you're working toward changes the neurological stakes in a way that private resolve, however sincere, rarely can. The eighth habit is the one that reveals something important about the hidden cost of doing everything right. Treating financial anxiety as a sign that something has gone wrong. Here's the thing about financial anxiety that almost no one says out loud. Research from financial therapists and psychologists studying the emotional experience of financially engaged people, including work from practitioners in the field of financial therapy examining money scripts and their psychological effects, has found that higher financial engagement is consistently associated with higher financial anxiety, not lower. The people most on top of their finances are often the people most worried about them. Not because their finances are in the worst shape, because awareness and anxiety run on the same neural circuitry. The mechanism is the brain's negativity bias, the well-established tendency to weight potential losses more heavily than equivalent gains, and to attend more vigilantly to threats than to reassuring information. A person who is financially engaged is a person who is regularly scanning for risk, modeling difficult scenarios, and noticing every gap between where they are and where they want to be. The same attentional orientation that makes them prepared makes them anxious. These are not two separate things. They are the same cognitive process operating at high intensity. Your brain attends more vigilantly to financial threats than to financial stability, even when stability is what your account reflects. This is why you can look at a healthy balance and still feel afraid. Why you can hit a savings goal and immediately start worrying about the next one. Why financial progress so rarely feels like arrival. It isn't evidence of failure, it is evidence of a nervous system that was trained to protect and has not yet been given permission to rest. You're not broken for feeling anxious about money while doing everything right. That experience is not a sign that something is wrong with your finances or with you. It is a sign that your brain is doing what a financially engaged brain does. Not a failure, a signal. And the habit of interpreting that anxiety as evidence of inadequacy adds a secondary layer of suffering on top of an experience that is already demanding. Now step back and look at all of these habits together, because here's what they share. They all feel like responsibility. They all look like discipline from the outside. They are all encouraged by conventional financial culture or tolerated as the acceptable cost of being good with money. And every single one of them has a mechanism by which it quietly works against the outcome it was designed to create. Not because the person practicing them is failing, but because the brain does not respond to financial rules the way the rules assume it will. The cost of hypervigilant tracking is the all-or-nothing rebound cycle that eventually breaks the system entirely. The cost of total deprivation is the compensatory spending that undoes weeks of restriction in a single depleted afternoon. The cost of debt-first rigidity is the compound growth that doesn't happen during the years spent eliminating balances that weren't costing what the missed returns were. The cost of waiting for readiness is the years the math required. The cost of obsessive portfolio checking is the anxiety and reactive decision-making that accumulates with every red notification. The cost of a fixed financial identity is the capability that never gets applied. The cost of financial isolation is the behavior change that never quite sticks. The cost of treating anxiety as failure is the suffering layered on top of suffering that was already there. None of these are character flaws. They are the predictable outputs of a brain navigating a financial system it was not designed for, using rules it was told were responsible, without anyone explaining what those rules actually cost. And here's something worth saying directly. The person who doesn't track obsessively, who spends on pleasure without guilt, who started investing before every debt was gone, who talks openly about money, who has made some kind of peace with financial anxiety, that person is not irresponsible. That person may have, through some combination of circumstance and temperament, found a way around some of the traps that the language of financial responsibility quietly sets. That deserves acknowledgement, not suspicion. What the research actually shows is that sustainable financial behavior is not about maximizing discipline or minimizing pleasure. It is about designing a relationship with money that the nervous system can maintain without constant override. That is a different target than the one most of us were given, and it is a more honest one. The balance looks different for every brain, every history, every set of circumstances and values. Some people genuinely thrive with rigorous tracking, and for them the system works. Some people need the complete payoff of a zero balance before they can direct attention elsewhere, and that is real too. Neither approach is objectively superior. They are different responses to the same underlying challenge, and both come with costs that deserve to be seen clearly, rather than glossed over with the language of virtue. The starting point is the same for everyone. Stop measuring your financial health by how much suffering it requires to maintain. The goal is not a system that looks like discipline from the outside while quietly grinding you down from the inside. The goal is a system that works without requiring you to fight yourself every single day. That system looks different for different people. But it starts with understanding what your brain is actually doing, and working with it instead of declaring war on it every morning. If something in this shifted how you see your relationship with money, if you recognized yourself in one of these habits and finally have a name for the cycle, drop a comment and tell me which one. I read them. And if you want to keep going deeper into the psychology of why we do what we do with money and why that's not a character flaw, subscribe. Understanding your own brain is the most underrated financial skill there is. This channel is created for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended to replace professional psychological, medical, financial, or therapeutic advice. Always consult with a professional.